Ever since I made those leaf kerchiefs, I wanted to do more clothing that looks like leaves, and this year I finally got around to doing some. My initial inspiration was these two little floral print bolero vests that Marla Loon made. The shape of the front edge looked like it would be really well suited to being a leaf. Actually, my first idea was that a black and white striped version would be good for representing the wing bars in a pine grosbeak themed outfit, and then while I was sketching that, I realized it would be a good leaf. I have a lot of ideas, so for this video I'm going to make 3 of them. A light green spring leaf, a dark green late summer leaf, and a dark brown late autumn leaf. Like the leaf kerchief video, the first one is the simplest and the next 2 are more complicated. I based the pattern on my 1770s waistcoat pattern, since I already had it and I like the way it fits. I tried on one of my waistcoats and pinned a piece of twill tape along where I wanted the new edge to be. Then I traced a copy of the pattern and measured and drew the line on. I cut the pattern out roughly so I could move it around more easily while drawing the veins on. Sketching the veins onto the back was easy, but the front took a bit more time and a lot of erasing. I taped the side seam together and cut a new one along one of the veins. Then I closed up a shoulder seam, leaving me with just one pattern piece. This does mean that the center front isn't on the straight of grain anymore, but there's not really a center front edge, and no buttons or anything, so it's fine. I made a quick mock-up in a stiff poly cotton blend. It fit pretty well, and the only change I made was to trim a little bit off the side of the neck. The reason you see me drawing an inch grid on the pattern is that I was going to make a digitally printed one, and I wanted to make sure that my scans were the correct size and not warped. But I still have not done any digital painting for that project, so please ignore the grid. And then it sat on my pattern rack for 1.5 years before I actually sewed it up. I didn't want to buy any new material for this project, and it turns out that I don't have many suitable fabrics in my stash. Most of it was either the wrong kind of fabric or not a leafy enough color. Eventually I decided to do a light green one, a dark green one, and a dark brown one. Just like in the leaf kerchief video, I want to start with the simplest one and then make the next 2 more complicated. For the first one I'm using a light green cotton that I found at the thrift store. It's got a sort of basket weave texture, which is not perfect for a leaf, but it'll do. It also has a little bit of sideways stretch, which I don't want, so for the lining I chose a very tightly woven off-white cotton. After making sure both fabrics were washed and ironed, I traced and cut out 2 pieces for the outside and 2 for the lining. I didn't cut closely around the serrated edges because those will be trimmed later. The outer fabric is thick enough and the lining is stiff enough that, since there aren't any buttons, it didn't need any interfacing. This leaf will have painted veins. They're much too curvy to be marked out with a ruler like I did on the leaf kerchiefs, so I decided to try tracing paper. I've had some for years but never used it. The yellow was just barely visible enough on the green. I tried all 3 of my tracing wheels and found the spiky one on the left was the best. It didn't leave as clear a mark as the other 2, but they were more damaging to both the fabric and the paper. You just put the colored side of the paper against the side of the fabric you want to mark, and roll the wheel along the line you want to trace. Do this on top of an ironing board or another lightly padded surface. The one thing I found really tricky was getting the pattern to stay still. The spiky tracing wheel really wants to shift it around, even with weights holding it down. As I talked about in the leaf kerchief video, the stuff I'm using to paint these veins is not actually paint. It's screen printing ink, which is not ideal for painting, and I'm only using it because I have a lot of it. Do not buy this to use for painting. It is not a good painty texture. I did a couple samples to make sure I was happy with the colors before I started on the actual garment. Due to the texture of the fabric, I can't really do long brush strokes. I can only dab the brush along, pushing it directly down so the paint gets into all the cracks. This does not make it very easy to do smooth, even veins, but I did my best. I painted all the veins I had marked with the tracing wheel, and left the center, back, and side seams alone. I let it dry overnight, but there's still more painting to do, so I won't heat set it yet. I then sewed only the center back seam. I trimmed the seam allowance and pressed it open, trying not to let the iron rest for too long on the ink. I find that if you heat set this ink and then try painting more on top of it, the new stuff doesn't stick very well to the old stuff. I painted the midrib and let it dry too. Then I did the same to the side seams, clipping the seam allowance on the inward curve and notching the outward curve. I should have sewed and painted them all at the same time, but for some reason I thought having the side seams closed would get in the way of the center back seam more than it did. I sewed up all 3 seams on the lining. Since that fabric is very sturdy and doesn't fray much, I trimmed the seam allowances down quite small. Then I pinned the lining to the outer fabric, right sides together, along the entire outside edge. First I lined up the ends of the seams and then the serrated tips. I sewed it with the lining fabric on top, since that outline was a lot clearer and easier to follow. Being a very wobbly seam, it went very slowly and took a lot of pivoting. I trimmed the lining seam allowances as closely as I could, and left the outer fabric a bit wider, since it frays much more easily. I carefully clipped all the inward curves and turned the whole thing inside out. I used my bamboo point turner on the tips, making sure to push from the lining side because I was worried it might poke through the green fabric. But actually a fingertip works just as well for points as shallow as these. I then carefully pressed all the edges so that none of the lining showed on the outside. Dipping your fingers in a little bit of water gives them a better grip on the fabric and makes it easier to work the seam all the way to the outside. Not all the vein tips lined up perfectly well, but I was already planning to add some shading to that edge, so I wasn't too concerned about it. I wanted to add a bit of top stitching to help keep it smooth and flat. On the leaf kerchiefs I did this by machine, but this time I did it by hand using a cotton hand quilting thread. I used a prick stitch, which is really just a widely spaced back stitch, though I had to stab stitch it on the ends of the seams where it was much thicker. The texture of the fabric makes it very subtle. Now the armholes needed finishing. I basted the two layers together a few centimeters in from the edge to keep them in place while I worked on it. I trimmed down the lining seam allowance to be fairly narrow, and once again I trimmed the outer seam allowance a bit wider. I clipped all around the lining because it's very stiff, but on that outer fabric I only did a bit of clipping on the straighter grain portions. I folded both edges in, with the lining edge being slightly further in so it doesn't show, and finished it with a whip stitch. As mentioned, I wanted to do some shading around the edge. I put just a little bit of paint on a somewhat round brush and pushed the bristles straight down into the edge of the leaf, but painted more lightly further in. I did shading like this on my light green leaf kerchief, but it came off in the wash. The veins on that one are still fine, but I guess the shading ink didn't sink into the fibers enough. But fortunately this one will be worn over a shirt, so it won't be subject to frequent washings like a head kerchief is. I did not paint the armholes. After once again letting it dry overnight, I heat set the ink. I like to use a silk organza press cloth so I can see what I'm ironing. At this point I could have called it finished, but I wasn't entirely happy with the edges of the veins. I tried adding some running stitches to see if it would help disguise the uneven edges. This is size 8 cotton pearl, and I don't want to tie big bulky knots with it, so I'm anchoring the ends in a similar way to how I start buttonholes, by waxing a centimeter or two on the end, hiding it in between the layers of fabric, and doing a couple of back stitches. The stitching did give the veins a bit more texture, but it wasn't a very big difference, so I'm not sure if it was worth spending several hours on. At least it made the inside look more interesting. Now that the first one was finished, I tried it on and found that the back seam was quite rippled. It was just a tiny bit rippled on the mock-up too, but the final version is much stiffer, which makes it a lot more noticeable. The rest of it fits pretty well though. For the second one, I chose this dark green plain weave cotton for the outside, and off-white cotton sateen for the lining. The green cotton is quite thin, but that's alright because I'm going to quilt it and add cording to the veins. Just another reminder that quilting and patchwork are not the same thing. My 1830s dressing gown is patchwork but not quilted, and this vest is quilted but not patchwork. Patchwork is lots of little bits sewn together, and quilting is a batting sandwich. Quilted garments are one of those things that I've wanted to try for years but had never gotten around to doing, and something fairly small and simple like this is a good thing to start with. First I had to fix my pattern. I traced a new copy, because in the past I have sometimes regretted making changes to patterns without keeping the old version for backup. I trimmed a little bit off the back curve, and I also took a little bit off the lower front of the armhole. Then I traced another copy so I could make a few more changes. I made the serrations a bit pointier, and I also drew the pattern a little bit bigger on every edge except the armhole. That wouldn't have been enough to account for the quilting on its own, though. I had made a sample and traced it before quilting and cording it, so I could see how much it shrunk, and it was a good few millimeters just on that little sample. I needed to expand my pattern by slashing and spreading it in several places. I only added 4 or 5 millimeters to each spot. I was just guessing and didn't want to overdo it. I pressed the tape down securely with a bone folder and drew on my grain line. For this one I wanted an asymmetrical back. I traced the pattern again so I could have different veins on the other half. I then realized that the pointier serrations did not work well on the back and I did not like them, so I filled them in a bit. Then I redrew the serrations on the other side. I added an extra little bump near the tip and just shuffled all the other ones over, so now the back veins are nicely staggered. I cut it out and used the spiky tracing wheel to mark the front veins on the second half. Then I drew on the back veins for the new serrations and was finally happy with the back. The fact that this will be machine quilted and corded presents 2 problems. The first is that I don't know exactly how much it will shrink, and it might turn out too small. And the second is that, with the sides and center back sewn up, this would be a somewhat awkward shape to maneuver under the machine. Not impossible, but not something I wanted to deal with on my very first machine quilting project. To avoid both of these problems, I decided to do lacing at the sides. That way I can quilt it mostly flat with only the slight curve of the center back seam to work around, and the sides will be adjustable. So I rounded off the side seam corners, and then the pattern was done. After ironing my fabric, I cut out each of my pieces once in the green and flipped them over to cut the lining. When cutting out asymmetrical stuff, you've got to make extra sure that the pieces are the right way up for each side. I marked the outer fabric with a yellow pencil and the lining with a regular graphite one. The scraps of batting I had planned to use turned out to be 3 different battings, and I didn't want to mix them up in case they were different thicknesses. Luckily, I had another similar one that I found at the thrift store a while ago, and it was big enough. The batting needs to be cut with no seam allowance, so I used a marker to trace it, and then cut inside the marker line. Since the cotton is attached to a stabilizing layer, I made sure that that side was facing up when I traced my pieces, so not as much fuzz would stick to the felt tip of the marker. I cut out small strips of buckram to reinforce the sides where the lacing will go. I sewed up only the center back seams on the outer and lining fabric. I connected the 2 pieces of batting with a large whip stitch so that it would lie mostly flat when spread out. I had tried a few different colors of sewing thread on the sample, but I didn't have enough of any one color. so I went and got 2 big spools of viscose embroidery thread, which I know is not quilting thread, but I had no problems with it. I didn't want to buy anything new for this video, but there's no way to get around not having enough thread. Before I could do the quilting, I had to attach the buckram. The pieces were a little bit bigger than the traced lines in a few places, and I had to trim the ends down. I sewed them onto the wrong side of the lining with the same viscose thread I'll use for the quilting. Then I had to attach the batting to the wrong side of the lining. I tried lining up the center back seams first, but that didn't work very well, so instead I lined up the extremities and smoothed the middle portion into place as I pinned. I basted the batting on with old cotton thread, making sure to leave the knots on the right side of the fabric so they'll stay on the outside and be easier to remove. This is to make sure the batting all stays in place while being turned right side out. After basting all along the edges, I did some more in the middle sections. I put the outer and lining fabric right sides together, and this time I did line up the center back seams first. I pushed the edges in on the green fabric just a little bit as I was pinning them. I want there to be slightly more fabric on the green side to minimize the chances of the lining showing. I made sure to mark a gap in the back of the armhole so I'd have an opening to turn it inside out. I also left a small opening at the back of the neck. Switching back to all-purpose thread and my adjustable zipper foot, I sewed around the outside edge with a very small stitch length. I tried to keep as closely as I could to the traced outline on the lining. I did buy a foot pedal for this machine after the shirt video, and it's working a lot better now, but it's still not the best at going slowly. I trimmed the seam allowance down very small, between 2 and 3 millimeters, but left it a bit wider on the 2 openings. And clipped all the inner curves as usual. Then I turned it right side out and pressed the edges. Having a layer of batting in the way made it harder to work the seams to the outside, even with wet hands. I slip stitched the big hole closed before pressing that area. I used the slightly angled edge on the ironing board to iron each half of the back. Tracing paper marks are not very easy to remove, and I'm not going to paint these veins, so this time I used a prick and pounce method, similar to the one often used for embroidery patterns. I went over all my lines with the tracing wheel. Then I laid my pattern back down, trying to get the edges lined up as well as I could, and brushed a little bit of blue chalk dust along all the lines so it went through the holes. This is a refillment for those chalk line maker things, but you can also sharpen a piece of tailor's chalk with a blade and collect the dust. That would actually be a much cheaper and more sensible option. Then I traced over those dotted lines with a fabric pencil. I made the veins wider as they got closer to the midrib. The midrib itself I drew on top of the tailor's ham, because the center back will not lie flat on the table. Keeping the back on the ham, I basted the center back almost all the way down to the tip. I'm using a different color from the thread I used to baste the lining, so I can tell them apart. I basted around all the areas between veins. I kept quite close to the edges and made the stitches closer together than usual. When I sewed the cording channels on my little sample, the fabric wrinkled a bit from being pushed along by the foot, so I'm doing this in the hopes of avoiding that. After the basting was done, I gave it another press and redrew some of the veins where the pencil had worn off. Then I switched back to the embroidery thread in my regular presser foot and top stitched all around the edge, starting and stopping on either side of the opening at the back of the neck. I left long tails so I could tie them off by hand and bury the ends. Then I took out all my purple basting, since it was just to hold the batting to the lining and I didn't need it anymore. I sewed a little channel right along the inside of the top stitching on all four side edges. And I sewed the individual veins, starting at the wider end, turning around at the tips, and then going back down the other side, again leaving long threads and tying them off. I kept going over the markings with more pencil before sewing them because they wore off pretty easily. For the branched veins I could go around a lot more edges at once without stopping. The veins are all sewn, and all that basting was worth it. I didn't get any major shifting or puckering. I'm going to do the quilting next, which will go around and around like this. And then after the quilting is done, I will do the cording. But because I'm doing lacing at the sides, I need to make sure that my quilting stitches will not get in the way of where the eyelets will be. So I'm going to mark those out first. Order of operations is very important. I'm going to do spiral lacing, so I marked out the top and bottom pairs of eyelets to be about even, the next eyelet just a short distance away, and then after that they're all staggered. They couldn't be the exact same distance apart because of the curve, and leaves are never perfect anyway, so I just eyeballed them instead of measuring. For the quilting, I'm using a free motion foot, which you can get for most machines. My machine doesn't have drop feed, so I have to cover the feed dogs with the throat plate that came with my buttonhole attachment. Then the foot can go wherever you move the fabric to. I started off doing circles around the edges, and then added more circles in between them, and sometimes inside them. I went slowly, especially near the veins, because I really don't want any of the stitching to go into the veins and get in the way of the cording. In hindsight, I should have done 2 or perhaps 3 lines of stitching when I first went around all the veins. That would have given me a bit more margin for error. The few times I did so too far inside a vein, I stopped and picked the stitches out, tied the threads off, and started again. I had to finish all the quilting before I could start the cording, because the cording will add a lot of bulk that would get in the way of the quilting foot. I removed the basting and worked on the quilting one section at a time. After the first few panels, I realized it looked much better if I kept the circles small around the edges next to the veins, and bigger in the center. I tried moving the fabric around with my hands on top of it, but having the throat plate screwed on meant that it didn't move smoothly enough, so I did it by carefully holding onto the edges instead. This was fine on the narrower parts, but once I got to the back it was a bit more frustrating. I had to pinch and fold the material to get a good grip. It took quite a few hours to finish all the quilting, and I spread it out over many days because holding the edges tightly can cramp up the hands awfully quickly. Near the end my machine began skipping stitches occasionally, but I changed the needle and then it was alright again. After the quilting was finished and the last few threads tied off, I started on the eyelets. I'm using size 8 DMC cotton pearl because I have some in my stash that's a very good color match. I'm waxing it to make it a bit stronger. I was worried the wax might pull some of the batting fibers out through the fabric, and if that had happened I would have stopped and switched to unwaxed, but it didn't. I think because the thread went through the buckram after going through the batting. I'm anchoring the pearl the same way I did on the first one, by burying the end under the lining and taking 1 or 2 back stitches so there are no large knots. I'm poking a hole with an awl, bringing the thread up through it, and sewing down into the edge from the top. The holes keep wanting to close up, so I have to open them up several more times with the awl as I sew around the edge. After finishing one eyelet, I move the thread underneath the fabric to get to the next one. This would definitely pull some fibers out if I were going through the batting, but I'm going in between the buckram and the lining fabric. After each row was finished, I just waxed the thread a bit more and buried it under the lining, the same as I do with buttonholes. The quilting caused a lot of warping. There was also a bit of pencil left that hadn't rubbed off, so I washed and rinsed it in hot water and hung it to dry. The washing shrunk it a little bit and made the texture more bumpy, just as I'd hoped it would. I didn't want to flatten it, but it was still warped, so I pressed it from the lining side on top of a towel. This did not fix all the warping, only some of it. I pressed the center back a little bit on the pressing ham to help it stay rounded. Now it was time to do the cording. This cotton yarn came in a mixed bag of thrifted embroidery floss a year or so ago. I kept it because I thought it might be useful for something, and it was. I used a tapestry needle to put the yarn in the channels. To get the needle into the fabric, I had to use an awl to push the threads aside and make a small hole. I cut a length of yarn and, starting at the narrow end of the vein, worked it through the veins with a tapestry needle. The double strand of yarn was still quite thin inside the cording channels, and I worked my way up the veins, adding increasingly shorter pieces of yarn. The yarn was very soft and squishy, so it fit really well into the tapered channels, and you can't see where any one piece ends. After pulling the yarn all the way through and stretching the fabric to make sure the yarn wasn't bunching it up, I cut the ends off as closely as I could and pulled them inside. I poked at the fabric some more with the awl to move the threads back into place. The green fabric is loosely woven enough that the holes close up again without a trace. For the longer veins that are connected to the midrib, I had a more difficult time getting them through, especially as more and more yarn built up in the center back and it became thicker and more difficult to scooch a needle through. I often had to poke the needle through to the outside and grip it with pliers in order to move the yarn further along, because the needle was so slippery I couldn't hold it still inside the channel. This is one situation where having a slightly corroded old needle may be a benefit. I brought the ends of these yarns out through that hole I left at the back of the neck. I sometimes brought the needle out through the lining side, but the sateen is more tightly woven and has floats, so it's more prone to snagging than the outer fabric. After a while, the large center back channel was getting pretty crowded, so I started ending the vein yarns just a little way into the midrib. I had to add quite a few little extra bits of yarn on the connecting ends of the veins, where they got very thick. After all the veins were corded, I pulled the center back tightly over the tailor's ham to make sure it had as much yarn drawn inside as would fit the length. Then I cut the ends off, folded those last little bits of seam allowance in, and sewed up the hole with silk thread. Here it is compared to the expanded pattern that I used. And here it is on my original pattern. As you can see, I slightly underestimated the shrinkage of the center back length, but was pretty spot on with the body circumference, which meant I had no fit issues. I laced up the sides with flat nylon braid for my stash. I used this old bodkin to put it through the holes, since that's what it's for, and it holds onto the end much more securely than a needle. After cutting it to the length I wanted, I ironed the braid nice and flat and put it through again, making sure not to twist it. I tried tying a fancy knot at the end, but realized I hadn't cut the laces long enough for that, so just did regular knots instead. And it was finished. Small interruption just to say that I have a Patreon and I've started doing bonus videos there. Unscripted ones that take much less time to make than this kind of video. I only have one so far, and it's a show and tell about all the unfinished projects on the pile, but I will make more. None of it will be useful sewing information because I really don't want to hide that behind a paywall, so it's just behind the scenes stuff. I will do a sewing room tour sometime soonish. I also do monthly update posts about the videos I'm working on, and because the Patreon started off just being for dinosaur comics, it also still has those. Marlo Loon, whose work inspired this video, also has a Patreon, and it's better than mine because you get art in the mail, which is where these two prints on the wall came from. Not that I think my Patreon is bad, it's just thematically incohesive. Anyways, thank you patrons for all the dentist appointments I've had this year. Back to sewing. The third and final leaf was originally meant to be a dark brown cotton sateen, lined with an ivory-colored figured cotton. Both of these fabrics are thrifted bed sheets, and unfortunately I'd already used up most of the brown. None of these little scraps were big enough to cut out the full pattern piece, but it looked so nice on the sample, and I thought I would have enough if I pieced it along the veins. I wanted this one to be more oak leaf shaped, so I redid my pattern again. This one will also be quilted, so I used the expanded version of the pattern. I traced it lightly and drew a smooth line along the tips of the serrations. I also fixed the ends of the side seams, because I'm not doing lacing on this one. I made a mock-up of this blank rounded shape so I could sketch out the new serrations in a light colored marker. Then I took it off and drew them on more neatly in a darker one. I cut out the new edge, traced it onto my blank pattern, and drew on the veins. I had to move the side seam again. I wanted some asymmetry on this one too, so I traced another copy and redrew the back edge so the veins would be staggered, and smoothed out one of the lobes in front so it only has one tip. I transferred the front veins to the second piece with the tracing wheel, same way I did last time. I wanted to make sure all the piecing was along the veins, so I made a second copy of my pattern and transferred all the veins again. I forgot to add balance marks the first couple of times I cut the pattern, and even when I did remember, I put some of them way too far apart. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought I would have enough sateen to do the whole thing, but it turned out I didn't have two pieces big enough to do both of those long sections that go around the shoulders, so even if I cut the pattern along every single vein, I still wouldn't have enough material for it. Fortunately, on my last trip to the thrift store, I had found a piece of plain weave cotton yardage in a very similar weight and color. There was way more than enough to cut both sides with no piecing, but by this point I was very attached to the idea of using the sateen. The two slightly different shades of brown looked so nice together, and I had already gone to the trouble of copying my pattern, so I decided to do a patchwork of alternating browns. I turned most of the veins into seams. I copied the grain lines onto all the pieces and made sure to note the left and right sides. I then numbered them all with light green and dark green markers, so I would know which piece was meant for which color. The smaller number of pieces fit easily onto my sateen scraps. I put some of them on the straight of grain and some on the cross grain, but I made sure none of them were on the bias. I left about 1 centimeter of seam allowance, but on the outer edges I left some fabric in between the bumps like I usually do. I kept them with their pieces after cutting, so it would be easier to arrange them. I laid them all out on the table and put the pattern away in a plastic sleeve. And sewed all those sections together. For opposing curves, I find it easier if I clip and notch the seam allowances before sewing them, at least in a well-behaved fabric like this. Probably not a good idea for something that frays easily. After both halves were assembled, I sewed the center back seam. I'm pretty happy with how well the curved seams turned out, but it would also be okay if they were a bit wonky. They're going to be quilted and then embroidered on top of, so they won't be visible when it's done. I then cut out the lining, first making extra sure that I had the pieces the opposite side up from the outer fabric. This time I'm using a washable marker because I know I'm going to wash it after quilting. As usual, I'm not cutting in between the serrations yet. I sewed and pressed the center back seam on the lining. The batting I used on the previous one had a stabilizing layer in it, but this one is just loose fibers, which makes it a bit less cooperative but a bit easier to piece. I cut my two pieces out of large scraps, and just feathered the edges and overlapped them. There were also some very thin spots that needed patching. Now the 3 layers are ready to go together. While I was working on the green quilted one, I learned that basting spray exists, and I was very intrigued, so I got some. It was awfully expensive, but I do want to make more quilted things, and I will definitely use it. Still trying not to buy new materials for this project, but I think this counts as more of a tool than a material. It's always best to make samples when trying something new, and I'm pretty sure I sprayed way too much on this one. It came out as a lot of wiggly white lines, a bit like silly string if it had a larval form. It was sticky to the touch, but did not leave any residue on my fingers. It's repositionable if you're sticking fabric to fabric, but this batting is too fragile to unstick without destroying it, so you've really got to place it correctly on the first try. After sewing around the edge of my sample, I found that it left a lot of sticky residue on my presser foot. And, as I expected, it was not suitable for basting the other side onto the batting in this particular situation. Obviously, for the regular kind of quilting where you just sandwich the 3 layers together and bind the edges afterwards, this would be fine to use on both sides. It's just because I have to sew and turn the edges first that it doesn't work here. Too much risk of pulling the batting apart and things sticking where they're not supposed to. But cutting down the hand basting by half still saves a lot of time and effort. I had seen some people online claiming that basting spray washes out, but it turns out it does not. So I'm very glad I didn't spray it directly on my table. I tried to scrub it off the vinyl tablecloth with warm soapy water and it had no effect. It was still sticky and there were little bits of goo that could be rolled together into bigger bits of goo. It's not showing up well on camera, but there is goo there. It feels just like the glue on stickers. It's like they put that in a spray can. On the can it says temporary, but it does not say anywhere that it's washable. The can also says does not gum needles, which I found to be mostly true, but it did still leave a little bit of gunk on my needle at one point while I was quilting. I've only tried this kind, and there's a lot of other brands. There's conflicting information on the internet about the other kinds, but I found an old blog post comparing several more, and it says they don't wash out either. So it's probably best to work under the assumption that whatever basting spray you're using does not wash out. But, do your own samples and see. I am still glad I bought this, and I think it'll be very helpful in making some quilted things for my everyday wardrobe, and eventually an actual quilt for my bed, but I won't use it on a quilted silk 18th century waistcoat, and I would never use it as a substitute for basting on anything that's not quilting or applique. With the basting in regular clothing construction, the whole point is that you can take it out afterwards, and this is not that. So, useful product, but slightly deceptive marketing in my opinion. So, having learned from my sample that I needed to keep it off the seam allowances and place it correctly the first time, I spread out my batting before doing any spraying. The baste overlaps came apart, but that was okay, because smaller pieces are easier to work with. I did the larger sections 1/2 at a time, flipping them over onto some flyer paper to spray them. I'm sticking the batting to the outer fabric because I want it to help all those seam allowances stay flat. Then I pinned the lining onto the outer fabric, right sides together, and sewed around the outer edge and armholes with a small stitch length, again using my zipper foot. I left the side seams open. It was a bit difficult to see the outline next to the batting, but it's okay if it's a little bit off, especially since this one is a dead rotting leaf. I had to re-sew the little bump at the base of the neck though, because it was not distinct enough the first time. Then I trimmed and clipped the seam allowances as usual, and turned it right side out through one of the side seam openings. I tried to make sure all the batting was smoothed out inside the tips. I pressed the edges, once again using a bit of water on my hands to help wiggle the seam to the outside. This disarranged a lot of the batting around the edge, and I didn't get all of it back into place, so the edges are a little bit uneven in thickness. After it was pressed, I basted the center back seam to keep it from shifting. Most of the veins were marked by the seam lines, but I still had some that were not, so I got my pieces out and marked them with the same prick and pounce method I used on the previous one. After doing the first one with a chalk liner refill, I remembered that I had wanted to use shavings from a regular piece of tailor's chalk, so I used that for the rest of them. I saved the rest of the chalk dust in a little tin. I then basted the rest of it, just like before. My original plan had been to hand quilt this. I tried some hand quilting on the first sample I did, but it just wasn't veiny enough. And I was already going to spend quite a lot of time hand embroidering it. So I decided to machine quilt this one too, and we'll have to wait and try hand quilting on some other project. Not having a suitable thread in my stash, I once again had to buy some. This time a large spool of cheap cotton quilting thread. I top stitched around the outside and the armholes, but left a gap of a few centimeters at the side seams. Sadly, the tension came out uneven, and I don't know why. It was mostly fine, but the top thread is way too loose in some places and made these awful loops. I stitched along all the veins and tied off and buried the thread ends. Not all the ends lined up perfectly, but they'll be covered up with embroidery. Changing back to the free motion foot, I added some quilting to my sample. I was worried there would be more tension problems, but it actually turned out fine. I didn't measure the shrinkage when I washed it, but I figured it would shrink a bit less than the more heavily quilted green one, and I was okay with that. It still fit well enough before the quilting. This time I'm doing the quilting in long, smooth, veiny lines, much farther apart. I want the focus to be more on the embroidery than the quilting, and I also don't want the quilting to take too long. I drew about half the lines on, gave that portion a press, and started quilting. I started and stopped a lot more this time. I would do a few lines and then tie off the ends because I didn't want to sew over any of the loose thread tails. I broke a needle pretty early on, and after that I tried several different new needles, and they all kept skipping stitches until I found one that was the right size. I also worried that the very large heavy spool might be affecting the tension, and I wound some thread onto a smaller one so that it would turn more smoothly. It was mostly okay after that, but still occasionally skipped stitches. Sometimes it was because the thread got caught on the take-up lever, so I think the thread is the problem. I probably should not have gone with the cheapest option. I did quite a lot of small connecting lines because I didn't want too many seams overlapping, so I had a lot of ends to tie off. Once the main part of the quilting was done, I pulled out all the basting. The side seams were small and fiddly enough that it was easier to just sew them by hand with a backstitch. After clipping the seam allowances and pressing them open, I smoothed out the batting over top. I clipped the seam allowances on the lining side too, and pressed the edges in. If this was on the outside, I would use a slip stitch so it wouldn't show, but it's the lining and a whip stitch is faster. I changed back to my regular presser foot to do the last little bit of top stitching on the bottom edge and the armholes. And after sewing along the side seam, I put the free motion foot back on to do the rest of the quilting. There were still a few places where the machine had skipped a lot of stitches, because I didn't pick out and resew all of them, so I hand sewed over top to fix it. I used the thread that was still on my needle from the side seams and forgot that I had waxed it, so unfortunately it did pull some of the batting fibers out. And then I washed it and hung it up to dry. Normally if I was making an embroidered garment, I would do the embroidery first before even cutting out the fabric. It's a lot easier to work on when you can stretch it out in a frame, and having the fabric under tension keeps the stitches from bunching it up too much, and then the back of your embroidery can be hidden under the lining when it's finished. But I couldn't do any of that here because the quilting needs to be done first, and because the embroidery is right on top of all the seams, and I can't put the finished garment in a frame or a hoop, so it'll just have to be bunched up in my hand. It was tough choosing embroidery colors for the veins. Most of my floss is secondhand, which means I've got wildly different amounts of a lot of different colors. I really liked how the orange pearl looked on my first sample, but I wasn't sure if one ball was enough for all the veins. There were all these smaller bits of light brown floss, but I didn't have enough of any of them. I have a huge amount of this rusty brown floss, but I wanted something more high contrast, and this is much too dark. This light beige was not a very inspiring option, but it was a safe one because there were 8 balls of it. I gave it a chance, but it just wasn't right for this project. Especially since the sample is only one of the fabrics, and the other one is a warmer shade of brown, which would look even worse under the relatively cool beige. So I decided to go with my first choice, and started the veins with a nice brownish orange pearl, even though I was worried I might run out. For the veins, I'm using a whipped chain stitch. As the name suggests, it's a chain stitch with a whip stitch around it. I hadn't heard of this variation until earlier this year when I saw a post about the RSN Stitch Bank, which is a very useful website with a lot of embroidery tutorials. They have drawings and photographs of each step, and you can flip them around for a left-handed view. I will link this tutorial in the description. When I tried it on my samples, I was very pleased by how the whip stitch smoothed out the line and made it more vein-like. And I found that you can whip 2 rows together for the wider parts of the veins. I'm starting off my pearl the same way as before. I was not at home while doing the embroidery, which is why the background is different and the lighting is worse. I started doing chain stitch up the center back seam, taking a small bite out of the surface of the fabric, wrapping the thread around the tip of the needle and pulling it through. Then sticking the needle back into the end of the loop, right where the thread is coming out, and doing it again. I'm trying not to pull too tightly because I don't want the tension to bunch up the fabric. To finish the thread, I stick the needle down outside the loop on the last stitch, and wax it and do a couple back stitches as usual. And then start a new thread, bring it up through the loop, and keep going. When I got to the very top, I took 2 stitches to anchor the last loop to the edge, and then turned around and started down. If I were doing regular chain stitches, I would probably want them to face all the same direction, but these will be covered up so it doesn't make much of a difference. I'm trying to keep the rows close together. It would also be nice if all the stitches were exactly the same length and all lined up next to each other, but all the seams and batting made it more difficult to push the needle through. I drew how wide I wanted the top of the midrib to be and embroidered along the two smallest veins. Then along the big shoulder veins. And after that I did the branching veins on the back, starting with the smallest ones. They all add to the midrib like river tributaries, the same way the cording did on the green quilted one. I went from the bottom up on the left-hand side and the top down on the right-hand side, so I would only have to scrunch up half the back in my hand as I worked. All 5 rows on the right side fit, but there was just one vein left when I'd filled up the top, so that one I started in the midrib just a few stitches above where it branches out. I had tried to keep the tension fairly loose, but all that stitching still pulled the center back seam enough to shorten it by at least 1 centimeter. I went over those last 2 neck veins and all the shorter ones on the other side of the armholes. Now all my veins were outlined, but I needed to taper them a bit. I wanted them to be 1 row of stitching at the tips and 3 rows at the bases of most of them. I'm adding them on the lower side so they can end at the small inner corners. First a short row, starting on top of the existing chain for the first couple of stitches, and then a longer row. The 2 pairs of branching veins that go over the shoulders only have 1 extra row of stitching, as does the smallest one at the bottom of the back. After all the chain stitch was finished, I was pleased to see that I still had a decent amount of purl left. For the whip stitching you need a blunt needle, so as to go around the other threads without piercing them. I was out of town visiting a relative at the time, and the only blunt needle I had was a bit smaller than what I would have preferred. I think this was a regular needle that I filed down at some point, so I had to be careful not to snag the floats on the sateen parts. To start off the threads I still used the sharp needle, because the blunt one cannot go smoothly through fabric and batting. Then once I've got the thread anchored and coming out the right spot, I switch to the blunt one. Wrapping it around the single row of stitches is very easy, but it gets a bit annoying with the doubled rows because the individual stitches don't all line up. And I finished off the threads in the usual way, once again switching back to the sharp needle. Here you can see how much veinier it looks now that all those chain links are smoothed over. For the small branching veins it was very easy to start with one end and then move up to covering the double row, before coming back to finish the second end. For the veins with 3 or more rows of stitching, I still only whipped around 2 at a time. On my sample I found that if I went around 1.5, it caused a groove in the middle, but if I go around 2 rows and then move the next line of whip stitching over by just 1 row, that middle row will be nicely secured from both sides and you'll have a good solid patch of stitching. It's not the easiest to see on the actual garment, so here it is drawn out with markers. This works for 3 rows and any number above that. On the midrib the chain stitches are packed in quite tightly and I couldn't always tell if I was grabbing the right number of stitches. But once again, leaves don't have to be perfect, especially not rotting leaves. I'm doing all the whip stitching from right to left, working from the bottom up, so it all slants in the same direction. Here's what it looked like with the left side all finished, and the right side without any whip stitching. A subtle difference, but definitely an improvement. Doing the chain stitch took quite a long time, but the whip stitching was comparatively fast. Now that the veins are all finished, I could start adding patches of blanket stitch honeycomb. I found this one on Pinterest, and it is not in the RSN stitch bank, so I will link that tutorial below too. On one of my samples I tried making the edges nice and smooth, but it turned out looking more like a dragonfly wing than leaf venules, which is pretty cool, but not what I was going for. It needed to be more ragged around the edges, like this bit. For this I'm using the more brown of those 2 balls of pearl. I'm a little bit puzzled by the beginning of the tutorial, because it looks like the working thread for the second row is at the beginning of the first row, but it doesn't really matter because the stitch works in either direction. I did blanket stitches along a small portion of the outside edge, and tried to keep it right on top of the top stitching. Before going any further, I lightly sketched out where I wanted my stitching to be, because I didn't want to cover the whole thing. I wanted it to be patchy like a real dead leaf. After finishing the first row, I can turn around and do the second. It's way too hard trying not to pierce the fabric when you're using a sharp needle on quilted material, so I'm putting it through the previous stitch's eye first. Sometimes I pass the needle through 2 or more of the previous stitches. This was helpful for decreasing in curved areas where things get smaller as you move further in, and for making occasional extra large stitches. And it can be done the other way around, taking 2 new stitches in between passing the thread under the one on the previous row. When I wanted to start a new patch that was not along the edge, I began by doing a line of little straight stitches like so, to avoid the solid line of a first row of blanket stitches. I'm pretty happy with the honeycomb stitching, though I think it would have been nice to make the size of the stitches just a bit less uniform. The final detail was to add some beading, which I was very excited about. I wanted it to look like slime mold growing along the edge of a leaf. More specifically, my inspiration was this photo by B. Leiderman on Instagram. It's been reposted a lot of times without credit, so I will leave a link in the description to the original post. She's got more slime mold photos and a lot of great bug photos too. On my sample I tried some shiny blue beads, but it turned out they were clear glass with a blue coating that wore off really easily, so I went with these other ones instead. They're a bit more of a greenish color than the inspiration, but the larger size and frosted texture work a lot better, and I was trying to use up things I already had. Since the slime mold has little white stems, I used fine white linen thread. I left a few millimeters of thread in between the beads and the edge of the fabric, so that I could wrap more thread around it to make the stems, just like how you make thread shanks when sewing on covered buttons. I put beads only along part of the back, making the spacing a bit uneven on purpose. And it was finished! Overall, I think these turned out really well, and I learned some new stuff, which is always good. I used my grandma's tracing paper for the first time, I learned about basting spray, and I finally tried free motion quilting. And I learned 2 new embroidery stitches, and my goal of using only stash material was mostly successful apart from the thread. I am quite proud of the pattern design and how the veins wrap around and look nice from every angle. My favorite thing about it is if you lay it flat on the table, it looks just like a big leaf with armholes. The first one was really simple to put together, and it turned out pretty good. I am happy with the colors. I think doing hand stitching along the veins was kind of a waste of time, but oh well. I am glad I did the prick stitch around the edges though. I like it better than the machine top stitching I did on those leaf kerchiefs. I probably would not have chosen this fabric if I were shopping for leaf fabrics specifically, but the geometric woven texture worked out pretty well, aside from making the painting a bit rough. On the second one, I'm really happy with the work itself, but really disappointed in how it looks from a distance. It doesn't look very much like a leaf when you can't see the cording clearly. The fabric is too dark and there's barely any contrast between it and the threads, and it just looks way too flat for something with so much texture. I considered painting the veins to be lighter, but I'm worried I'd ruin it. If I was going to paint something quilted, it would be much better to paint it before quilting so none of it gets on the threads. If I turn it inside out, the stitching shows, but the lining's not a leafy color, so it doesn't look very good that way either. But I think the quilting itself turned out mostly pretty good, and it was really fun to try the cording. It was tedious but not difficult. I wish I had done the smaller circles around the edges from the beginning, but I did expect that I would get better as I went, which is why I started in the underarm area. I do also think that overall I made it too dense. I've seen a lot of nice free motion quilting pictures online, and it's the combination of the larger shapes with the more densely quilted areas that makes it interesting. And this one's just dense all over. Also, the braid I used for the lacing turned out to be too slippery and started coming untied after just a couple of wears. I didn't have a lot of lacing options in my stash, and I thought the shiny white would be nice because it's kind of like when a tailor bird sews leaves together with spiderwebs, but meh. This is a lot of complaining for something that turned out fine. I think all the techniques are good, it's just not the effect I was going for. It's fine, it's just boring. Someday I might go back and add some shiny beads and braid some nice green cords for the lacing, and maybe paint the veins, but probably not anytime soon. The brown one is definitely my favorite. It turned out so good. I was quite frustrated with how the machine kept skipping stitches and the tension issues I had with the top stitching, but that's pretty much the only complaint I have. I'm really glad I did the patchwork of the 2 different browns. That was definitely worth the effort, and I love how all the colors look together. And I'm very happy with the embroidery and beading. Doing it without a hoop or frame did scrunch up the center back a bit, even though I tried to keep the tension loose, but that just gave it a more realistic leaf texture. And I love my little slime mold beads. I would have modeled this one lying down in some actual dead leaves like I did last time, but there was already snow on the ground by the time I filmed the outfits. So I haven't worn any of these out yet because they're more of a warm weather thing. And I think they might be a bit outside my comfort zone for everyday wear. Either way, it was fun to learn some new things. If you make one, I would love to see pictures. You could do so many different things with it. It doesn't need to be a leaf. It could be a petal or a flower, or the sepals on top of a dress that looks like a flower. You could even crochet one that looks like a leaf skeleton, and then put slime mold beads on that. Thank you for watching. Bye!